He thought she'd cower, like the others. Another black woman to push around. He was wrong, so wrong. Road wet, lights flash. Officer Briggs, license, registration, no greeting, tail lights out, he says. Are you arguing? Shift in the air, power, resistance. Step out. Mind telling me why? Because I said so. You're under arrest. I know what I can do, what you can't. Then the cuffs. Too tight. You don't know what you're doing. Lady, I know exactly, but he didn't, not even close. You must really think you're somebody. Then the cell. Cold, hard, unforgiving. Comfy? Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be. What the hell did you do? People talk. High places. He wasn't in control anymore. He never was. The Birmingham highway was almost deserted that night. Just a few cars slipped past, their headlights briefly painting the wet pavement before disappearing into the darkness. The streetlights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that danced and stretched across the asphalt. It was late, well past 11, the hour when most folks just wanted to be home. Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson had been driving for nearly 2 hours, her fingers drumming a soft rhythm against the steering wheel, humming along to a low, mellow jazz tune. She wasn't in uniform, just a simple black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back. She didn't think she stood out. Then she saw the lights in her rearview mirror, red and blue, flashing, growing closer fast. Her stomach tightened, not with fear. She knew the routine, the dance, the way these things usually went, but with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She signaled, changed lanes, and eased her car onto the shoulder, parked, took a slow, steadying breath, kept both hands visible on the steering wheel. Years in the military had taught her that drill. A white patrol car pulled up behind her. The officer took his time getting out. When he finally did, he moved with a deliberate, almost heavy gait, the kind of movement that suggests he expects obedience. Heavy boots crunching on the asphalt, one hand resting low on his hip, the other holding a flashlight that snapped on as he approached. Renee watched him in the side mirror. The name on his badge glinted in the light. Briggs. License and registration, he said, his voice flat, practiced, impatient. No greeting, no explanation, just a demand. Renee met his gaze in the mirror, then reached slowly into her glove compartment, pulling out her documents. Was I speeding, officer? She asked, her voice steady, calm. Briggs didn't answer immediately. He took the papers from her hand, holding them just out of reach as he gave her car a cursory once-over. Taillights are out, he stated, his tone clipped. Renee frowned. That can't be right. They were checked a few weeks ago. She paused. But if there's an issue, I can get them fixed. Step out of the car, Briggs interrupted, cutting her off as if she hadn't spoken. Renee exhaled slowly. She glanced at the near-empty highway. No witnesses. She tapped her fingers lightly against the steering wheel, then reached for the door handle. Mind telling me why? She asked, her voice quiet, measured. Briggs tilted his head, a smirk playing on his lips. Because I said so. The silence hung heavy in the night air. Renee unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the car door. The night air was cooler than she expected. She stepped out onto the pavement, her posture relaxed but firm. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wouldn't be bullied either. Briggs took a step back, his eyes scanning her. She felt him sizing her up, assessing how much he could get away with. Turn around, hands on the car. This time, Renee hesitated. Why? Briggs took a step closer, the smirk fading from his face. Are you resisting? Renee held her ground. No, I'm asking a question. A flicker of something. Annoyance? Amusement? Maybe both, crossed his face. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. We got a non-compliant driver here, he muttered, then louder. Turn around. Her pulse quickened, but her expression remained neutral. Officer, she said, her voice low but firm, I need you to understand something. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do. And Briggs didn't like that. His jaw tightened. You're under arrest, he snapped, reaching for her wrist. Renee moved before he could grab her, stepping back just enough to avoid his grasp. Under arrest for what? Briggs pulled out his cuffs, for obstructing an officer. Renee exhaled sharply through her nose. So that was his game. Her military training kicked in, heartbeat steady, breathing even. She knew she had two choices, comply and fight this later, or push back and risk escalation. She wasn't about to become another statistic. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned, placing her hands on the roof of her car. The cool metal grounded her. He barely looked at the documents, his eyes lingering instead on Renee's car. The flashlight beam danced across the paintwork, highlighting tiny imperfections she hadn't even noticed. There was a long, uncomfortable pause, the silence thick with unspoken tension. Renee felt it, the weight of his gaze, the subtle shift in the power dynamic. It was a familiar feeling, one she'd encountered countless times during briefings in foreign lands, in exercises designed to prepare sailors for the harsh realities of a world far removed from the structured order of the Navy. She knew better than to push, yet she also knew her rights. He finally spoke, his words sharp, devoid of any courtesy. "Taillights are out," he said, the statement more of an accusation than an observation. Renee's brow furrowed. "That can't be right," she replied, her voice measured, calm. "They were checked just a few weeks ago." Briggs didn't acknowledge her statement. He held her license and registration aloft, seemingly studying them for flaws that weren't there. His grip was unnecessarily tight, almost possessive. The small gesture, the subtle power play, spoke volumes. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the faint hum of the jazz music still playing softly from Renee's car. It felt like an eternity, this unspoken battle of wills, a silent clash of power and resistance. She'd seen this before, this subtle dance of intimidation, this calculated attempt to break someone down, to force compliance. The smirk reappeared on Officer Briggs's face, a thin, cruel line that stretched across his lips. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his gaze still fixed on her car. "Step out of the car," he commanded, the words dripping with impatience. Again, she tried a different tack, hoping for a sliver of reason, of professionalism. "Officer," Renee began, her voice steady, "my taillights were checked recently. If there is a problem, I'm happy to address it." He cut her off, his tone hardening. "I said, step out of the car." His hand instinctively moved towards his belt, a barely perceptible shift that sent a shiver down Renee's spine. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. This was something else entirely. This was about control, about asserting dominance. She exhaled slowly, a silent prayer escaping her lips. This wasn't the battlefield, but the fight was real, nonetheless. The exhaustion she'd felt earlier was now replaced with a quiet determination, a steely resolve. The battle lines were drawn. It was a test, a challenge, and she wouldn't yield. She knew exactly what he was doing. She'd seen it before, this subtle, insidious brand of intimidation. But this time, it wouldn't work. This time, it wouldn't be enough. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Renee's calm explanation about her taillights seemed to vanish into the void, swallowed by Officer Briggs's growing impatience. He didn't even look at her as he repeated his order, his voice harder this time, sharper, laced with a barely concealed threat. "Step out of the car." She didn't move. A quiet strength settled over her, a calm born of years spent navigating complex and dangerous situations. This wasn't a battlefield, but the principles were the same: assess, understand, react. His words were an attempt to assert his authority, to strip her of her composure. She wouldn't let him. His hand hovered near his holster, a silent, unsettling gesture that spoke volumes. The casual, almost offhand movement communicated more than any spoken threat. It was a display of power, a subtle flexing of muscle designed to intimidate. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the quiet, insistent drumming of Renee's fingers against the steering wheel. It wasn't a nervous habit. It was a grounding mechanism, a way to maintain control in the face of escalating pressure. In that moment, the highway felt vast and empty, the silence pressing in, amplifying the weight of the confrontation. He took a step closer, his shadow looming over her, the flashlight beam cutting a harsh line across her face. The smirk was gone now, replaced by a cold, hard glint in his eye. It wasn't a look of anger. It was something colder, more calculating, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. He was no longer trying to subtly intimidate. He was now openly showing his disdain. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Would she comply? Would she back down? Would she become just another statistic in a long, sad line of injustices? She could almost feel the weight of expectation, the pressure to conform, to submit. But something deep within her refused to yield. A quiet defiance settled over her, not a boisterous rebellion, but a quiet internal strength that held its ground against his bluster and his thinly veiled threats. This was not just about a broken taillight. It was about something far more profound. It was a battle for dignity, for respect, for the right to be treated with fairness and decency. And she knew, deep in her bones, that she had to fight. The question hung in the air, a fragile thing against the backdrop of the officer's simmering anger. Renee's quiet inquiry, a simple request for an explanation, seemed to ignite something within him, a spark of barely controlled fury. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he took a step closer, his shadow falling across her, the weight of his presence pressing down. His hand, still clutching her license and registration, tightened. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it communicated volumes, a silent assertion of power, a deliberate attempt to assert his dominance. His eyes narrowed, hardening, the casual smirk replaced by a chilling intensity. "You're under arrest," he stated, the words harsh, clipped. Before she could even begin to protest, before she could even fully process his abrupt escalation, his hand shot out, grabbing for her wrist. Renee reacted instantly, a lifetime of training kicking in. She moved just enough to evade his grasp, her own movement precise, calculated. The years in the military hadn't just taught her discipline and obedience, they had also honed her instincts for self-preservation. In this moment, every training drill, every high-stakes operation, every tense interrogation she'd ever endured seemed to coalesce into a single, focused point of resistance. "Under arrest for what?" she asked, her voice quiet, even, devoid of any hint of panic or fear. Her calmness was a weapon, a quiet power in the face of escalating aggression. He didn't answer her directly. Instead, he pulled out his handcuffs, the glint of metal a stark contrast to the darkness of the night. His voice hardened even further, the words heavy with accusatory weight. "For obstructing an officer." The words hung in the air, a calculated insult, a blatant disregard for her rights, a thinly veiled attempt to justify his unwarranted aggression. The breath caught in her throat, a silent gasp of disbelief. This was it. This was the culmination of everything he had been building toward. This was his game. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the dull ache of injustice, the sharp sting of being unfairly targeted. But beneath the anger, a colder, deeper emotion settled, a quiet, determined resolve. She knew, with an icy certainty, that he'd made a colossal mistake. He had no idea whom he'd just arrested. He'd just crossed a line, and she would make sure he paid for it. The weight of his handcuffs didn't crush her spirit. Instead, it fueled her defiance. This night wouldn't break her. It would make her stronger. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, the pressure surprisingly tight, deliberately so. He didn't bother to adjust them, didn't offer a word of apology or explanation as he roughly shoved her toward the back of the patrol car. The hard plastic seat dug into her back, a small, insignificant discomfort that somehow amplified the larger injustice. She sat still, her breath coming in slow, measured gasps. The metallic tang of blood filled her nostrils, a faint scent from the scrape of the handcuffs against her skin. Her wrists burned, a physical manifestation of the injustice she was enduring, but the pain was secondary to the simmering rage that filled her. This wasn't just about the handcuffs. It was about the casual cruelty, the blatant disregard for her rights, the insidious, underlying prejudice that had fueled this entire encounter. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights reflected in the polished surface of the car, painting streaks of color across the dark asphalt. She could hear Officer Briggs's muttered words on his radio, a low, indistinct hum that carried a hint of smug satisfaction. He'd won, hadn't he? He'd successfully broken her, subdued her, reduced her to just another statistic, a black woman he could intimidate and control. But in the quiet of the patrol car, she found a different kind of strength. This wasn't the first time she'd faced down adversity. She'd endured combat drills, high-stakes operations, interrogations in hostile foreign territories. She'd seen the worst of humanity, felt the chilling touch of fear and despair. But this was different. This was a man with a badge, drunk on the illusion of power, convinced of his own invulnerability. And that, she thought, was the greatest vulnerability of all. She focused on her breathing, the rhythm steady and controlled, a reminder of the training that had carried her through far worse. The cold metal of the handcuffs, the dull ache in her wrists, these were small inconveniences compared to what she had endured before. This was nothing, but that didn't mean it wasn't infuriating. That didn't mean she wasn't angry. That didn't mean she wouldn't fight. The reflection of her face in the partition stared back at her, calm, composed, yet beneath that surface calm, a deep, unwavering current of resolve. She was still a lieutenant commander, a trained professional, a woman of principle. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her, dehumanized her, and now she would make him pay. This wasn't about the broken tail light. It was about the abuse of power, about racism cloaked in the guise of authority, and she wouldn't rest until justice was served. One night in this cold, hard cell wouldn't break her. It would only steel her resolve. This wouldn't be her last stand. This would be the beginning. The patrol car lurched forward, the red and blue lights painting streaks of color across the wet asphalt. Renee sat rigidly, the handcuffs biting into her wrists, her breath shallow and controlled. She could feel the burn, a physical reminder of the injustice she was enduring, but her gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear, of witnessing her break. Briggs whistled a jaunty tune, a jarringly cheerful melody that somehow amplified the grim reality of her situation. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking in its audacity. He was enjoying this, relishing his power, reveling in the control he held over her. After a moment, he spoke, his voice casual, almost conversational. "You know," he said, his tone laced with a smug superiority, "most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out." Renee exhaled sharply through her nose, her silence a testament to her contained fury. She wouldn't engage in his petty games, wouldn't give him the validation he craved. Her silence was a quiet power, a refusal to acknowledge his dominance. He chuckled, shaking his head. And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop. He seemed to find this wildly amusing, this outrageous abuse of power. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on the blurring lights outside. His words were a blunt instrument of arrogance, an attempt to diminish her, to make her feel small, insignificant. It was a tactic she'd seen before, a calculated attempt to undermine her confidence and erode her sense of self. "Lady," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "you must really think you're somebody." "I don't think," she replied, her voice low even. "I know." Her simple statements seemed to momentarily disrupt his smug facade. His knuckles tightened around the wheel. A flicker of irritation, a crack in his carefully constructed composure, briefly broke through. He quickly regained his composure, though. The irritation quickly masked. "You military?" he asked, his tone shifting, a sudden curiosity replacing his earlier arrogance. When she remained silent, he continued, his words dripping with condescension. "Yeah, I figured. You got that attitude, that above-the-law type. Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh?" The audacity of his words, the sheer gall of it, made her jaw clench. His actions were her fault? The silence stretched between them, filled only with the hum of the engine and the flashing lights. He was oblivious to the deeper implications of his actions, of the systematic racism that allowed him to operate with such impunity. This wasn't about her. It was about a pattern of misconduct, a disregard for justice, and she would make sure it didn't go unpunished. He'd just given her far more ammunition than she could have hoped for. The station smelled of stale coffee and sweat, a grimly familiar aroma that clung to the air like a second skin. Renee was led through the booking process. Fingerprints, mugshot, the whole humiliating routine. The officers behind the desk barely glanced up, their indifference a chilling testament to the systemic apathy that allowed men like Briggs to thrive. She'd seen this kind of disinterest before, this casual disregard for human dignity, this willingness to overlook injustice. It was a familiar weariness that settled deep in her bones. Briggs, his earlier swagger now replaced by a smug satisfaction, loomed nearby. He uncuffed her long enough to push her through each step of the process, his touch unnecessarily rough, his presence a constant, irritating reminder of his power. He muttered something under his breath, a taunt barely audible, but sharp enough to sting. "You think you're smart, huh?" She met his gaze briefly, her expression unreadable. "I don't have to think," she replied, her voice steady and calm. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of years of experience, of calculated restraint, of knowing exactly how much she could tolerate before responding. His grip on her wrist tightened, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that spoke volumes. He knew, she thought, that he'd pushed too far, that he'd stirred something he couldn't control. He sneered, shoving her towards the holding cell. "Enjoy your stay," he hissed, his words a cruel afterthought. The metal bars slid shut, the lock clicking into place with a finality that resonated far beyond the sound itself. The chill of the metal bench pressed against her jeans, a cold, hard reality that underscored the injustice of her situation. She took a deep breath, her chest tightening, the familiar sense of confinement washing over her. This wasn't her first experience with harsh conditions, with the threat of real danger. She'd faced far worse in combat zones, in places where the threat wasn't just discomfort, but death. Yet this was different. This was an assault on her dignity, a blatant abuse of power, and the indignity of it settled deep within her. It wasn't the physical discomfort of the cell that gnawed at her, but the underlying contempt, the casual racism, the systemic injustice that had led her here. Through the bars, she could hear the faint murmur of voices in the station, the shuffle of paperwork, the clatter of a coffee cup, the mundane sounds of a system that had failed her. It wasn't just Briggs, it was the entire system that had enabled him. It was a system that she would now dedicate herself to dismantling. One night, one arrest, one injustice wouldn't break her. It would only fuel her fire. The cold pressed through her jeans, seeping into her bones. The metal bench was unforgiving, hard, and utterly unyielding. She shifted slightly, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness that was already creeping into her muscles. The cell wasn't much. 4 walls, a single flickering light bulb, and the faint, lingering smell of old sweat and disinfectant. She'd spent nights in far worse conditions, in places where the threat wasn't just discomfort, but real, immediate danger. This was nothing, objectively, but that didn't mean she wasn't angry. A quiet, controlled anger that burned slowly, steadily, beneath the surface of her calm. She focused on her breathing, the slow, even rhythm, a practiced response, a tool honed by years of military training. Control the breathing, control the mind. It was a mantra drilled into her long before she'd ever set foot on a Navy ship. Through the bars, she could hear the muffled sounds of the station, the faint murmur of officers' conversations, the occasional rustle of paperwork, the clatter of a coffee cup against a desk. The sounds of a system functioning, oblivious to the injustice it had just perpetuated. The sounds of a system she would help to change. Then, heavy footsteps. She didn't need to see him to know it was Briggs. His stride had a distinct, arrogant rhythm, the gait of a man who believed himself untouchable. He appeared a moment later, arms crossed, his familiar smirk plastered across his face. "Comfy?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. She didn't answer, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Her silence was a weapon, a refusal to engage with his petty taunts. She would let him underestimate her. She would let him believe he'd won. He leaned closer to the bars, his voice low and menacing. "You know, if you just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now." A slow smile curled the edges of her lips. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something. Annoyance? Uncertainty? Crossing his eyes before he quickly masked it. He scoffed, glancing at the empty holding area. "No one's coming to get you tonight, lady," he said, his voice dismissive. "Guess that means you'll have some time to think about that attitude." She watched him, unmoved, unshaken. He continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "People like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little confidence is enough to get out of trouble." He rambled on, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing within her. His words didn't matter. He didn't know what was coming. And as if on cue, another officer approached, a younger man, his face etched with uncertainty. This was it. The wheels were turning. The consequences of Briggs's actions were about to catch up with him. She had played the long game. It was time to reap the rewards. The game was far from over, but tonight she was winning. Briggs reappeared, his swagger returning, his smirk back in place. He leaned close to the bars, his voice low and condescending. "Comfy?" he sneered. "You know, if you just played along, none of this would have happened." Renee simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction, wouldn't let him see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. He was playing a game, and she was playing a different one, a much longer game. He was focused on the immediate gratification of his power, while she had her eyes on the bigger picture. He continued his taunts, his words designed to provoke a response, to break her composure. He spoke of the rules, of the expectations, of the consequences of not conforming. He was reveling in his perceived victory, in the power he held over her. He was unaware that his victory was fleeting. Then a younger officer approached, a hint of hesitation in his demeanor, a nervousness that was a stark contrast to Briggs's overconfidence. He held a clipboard, his eyes darting between Briggs and Renee, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and concern. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. A silent tension had settled over the room. Sergeant," the younger officer began, his voice barely a whisper. "We got a call." He paused, his words catching in his throat, the weight of the news clearly heavy on his shoulders. "And I think you need to see this." Briggs barely glanced at him, his attention still fixed on Renee. The younger officer shifted uneasily from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He seemed hesitant, unsure how to proceed, his confidence undermined by the palpable tension in the room. Briggs frowned, a crack appearing in his previously impenetrable facade. He looked at Renee, his expression for the first time devoid of smugness. It was a look of something close to fear, an almost imperceptible shift that went unnoticed by the younger officer, but registered instantly with Renee. It was the beginning of the end for Briggs. The power dynamic had shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, but the shift had begun. He turned away, the smirk finally gone, his shoulders slumping slightly, and muttered something under his breath. He was no longer in control of the situation. The game had changed. And Renee knew, with a deep sense of satisfaction, that she'd played her hand perfectly. The pieces were falling into place. Justice was about to be served. The tide was turning, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The hushed conversation between the officers was fragmented, but Renee caught enough to understand the shift in the power dynamic. Words like lawyer, higher-ups, and questions hung in the air, heavy with implication. She could sense the growing unease in the younger officer's voice, the subtle shift in his posture, a subtle but distinct change from his earlier hesitation to a newfound assertiveness. Briggs's voice, when she heard it, was sharp, laced with a sudden, unexpected annoyance. It was a jarring contrast to his previous arrogance, the sound of a man whose control was slipping away. The younger officer's stammering response only seemed to fuel his anger. Then, heavy footsteps again. Briggs stormed back, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, his fists clenched at his sides, the smug smirk completely gone. He stopped in front of Renee's cell, his gaze burning into her. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded, his voice barely a growl. Renee leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her expression composed, almost serene. "I didn't do anything," she replied, her voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of quiet strength. "But people talk, and some of us have friends in very high places." The words hung in the air, a subtle but potent challenge. She watched as the realization dawned on Briggs's face, the color draining from his cheeks, the arrogant swagger melting away. The shift in power was palpable, a silent acknowledgement that he was no longer in control. The power he'd wielded so casually, so callously, was suddenly, unexpectedly, slipping through his fingers. He turned abruptly on his heel, muttering under his breath, disappearing down the hallway. The sound of his retreating footsteps was oddly satisfying, the final punctuation mark to his downfall. Renee exhaled slowly, a long, controlled breath that expelled the tension that had been tightening in her chest. It wouldn't be long now. The truth was out. The consequences of Briggs's actions were about to catch up with him. He'd underestimated her, misjudged her, and now he would pay the price. The weight of his actions, of his arrogance, of his abuse of power was finally beginning to crush him, the same way he'd tried to crush her, the same way he'd tried to crush so many others. The tide had turned, and Renee knew, with unshakable certainty, that justice was on its way. The courtroom air was crisp, carrying a chill that settled deep in the bones if you remained still for too long. Renee stood near the defendant's table, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, alert. No handcuffs, no orange jumpsuit, just a well-tailored navy blue blazer, a simple blouse, and an undeniable presence that filled the space. Beside her, her attorney, Carla Whitman, flipped through a stack of papers, her movements efficient, methodical, devoid of any wasted motion or small talk. Renee appreciated that. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Briggs entered. He still carried himself with an air of entitlement, shoulders squared, chin lifted. But there was a subtle difference, a stiffness in his gait, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The confidence he'd exuded the previous night was noticeably diminished, replaced by a nervous tension that was almost palpable. Renee caught his eye briefly. He looked away quickly. Good. The judge, Judge Alan Kirkland, a weary-looking man with spectacles perched on his nose, entered, and the room fell silent. He sighed, glancing over the case files. "All right," he said, his voice devoid of any unnecessary flourish. "Let's get to it." The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began, his voice measured and controlled, "we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs." A murmur rippled through the room, a low hum of anticipation that underscored the gravity of the moment. Briggs shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The judge peered at him over his glasses. "Sergeant Briggs," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Care to explain?" Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat, his voice attempting to project an air of confidence it clearly lacked. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop." The prosecutor cut him off smoothly, his voice polite but unwavering. "Uncooperative?" Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record shows a distinguished military career, graduation from the Naval Academy, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling me that despite all this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken taillight? Briggs opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken accusations. The prosecutor continued, his voice gaining strength, each word adding to the weight of evidence. He spoke of an internal review, of a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in Briggs' district. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a rising tide of outrage. Briggs's face darkened, the color draining from his cheeks. The smug arrogance of the previous night was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. The game was up. The carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The truth was coming out. The prosecutor's words hung in the air, each syllable carrying the weight of accumulated evidence. He paused, allowing the silence to amplify the impact of his statement, before continuing. "Additionally," he said, his voice steady, controlled, "an internal review of your arrest history shows a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district." A ripple of murmurs moved through the courtroom, a wave of unspoken accusations that washed over Briggs, stripping away the last vestiges of his carefully constructed composure. His face darkened, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He was no longer the confident officer. He was a man exposed, cornered, facing the consequences of his actions. The prosecutor continued, his voice gaining momentum, building to a crescendo that would leave no room for doubt. "And, Your Honor," he stated, his tone unwavering, "the body camera footage says otherwise." Another wave of murmurs swept through the room, a chorus of disbelief and outrage that amplified the growing sense of unease in the courtroom. Briggs's gaze darted to the judge, then to his attorney, then back to the prosecutor. He was visibly shaken, his carefully crafted defense crumbling before the weight of undeniable evidence. The judge, his expression weary but firm, glanced toward the bailiff. "Let's play the footage." A large screen descended from the ceiling at the front of the courtroom, its blank surface a stark contrast to the tense anticipation in the room. The video began to play, capturing the events of that night from Briggs's perspective. The harshness of his commands, the unnecessary escalation, the smug way he tightened the cuffs, all were laid bare for the courtroom to see. Renee didn't need to watch. She'd lived it. The room was deathly silent as the footage played, each frame a damning testament to Briggs' misconduct. The silence spoke volumes, a stark contrast to the earlier arrogance he'd displayed. When the footage ended, the judge leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Sergeant Briggs," he said, his voice low, measured, "you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details in your initial statement. Briggs opened his mouth to speak, but the judge's gavel came down, sharp and final. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed, the judge declared, his voice ringing with authority. And I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs's conduct. The tension in the room snapped like a pulled rubber band. Briggs looked like he'd been punched in the gut, his face flushed, his hands clenched into fists. Renee simply exhaled, slowly, releasing the breath she'd been holding. She'd never had a doubt. The weight of the last 24 hours, the intimidation, the arrest, the night in the cell, lifted from her shoulders, replaced by a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had won. Not just for herself, but for all those who'd been silenced. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory, a beginning. The hallway felt colder now, the air heavy with the unspoken weight of the events that had just unfolded. Briggs stormed out of the courtroom, his heavy footsteps echoing down the polished halls, the sound a stark counterpoint to the quiet hum of activity that had resumed. His face was tight, his jaw clenched, his shoulders rigid. He could feel the eyes on him, other officers, court staff, even the reporters who'd arrived after word of the case spread. This wasn't the control he was used to. He was accustomed to commanding respect, to inspiring fear, to walking into a room and instantly asserting his dominance. But now the power he'd taken for granted felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Then a sharp voice cut through the hallway noise. "Sergeant Briggs." He turned. Chief Eldon Baker stood before him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The older man had been on the force for over 30 years, a respected figure whose word carried considerable weight. Briggs straightened instinctively, his body tensing, his instincts telling him to brace himself. "Sir," he replied, his voice tight. Baker studied him for a long moment, his gaze unwavering, before nodding curtly. "Follow me." The silence in the private office was heavier than the hallway noise. Baker closed the door firmly behind them before speaking, his tone dropping to a low, almost conversational level that was far more menacing than any shout. "What the hell were you thinking?" Briggs exhaled sharply, his voice strained. "I was doing my job." Baker scoffed, tossing a file onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud that echoed the weight of the accusation. "That's not what it looks like from here. The body cam footage, the arrest history, the fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting." Briggs's nostrils flared. "What does that have to do with anything?" Baker leaned forward, his voice quiet but sharp. "Everything. This wasn't some random woman. This was a high-ranking Navy officer. You think this is just going to disappear?" Briggs looked away, grinding his teeth, his arrogance finally cracking. "She was disrespectful. She questioned me." Baker cut him off, his voice even colder. "That's not a crime." Briggs scoffed, shaking his head, his voice laced with disbelief. "You don't get it. People like that." Baker's expression hardened, his eyes unwavering. "People like what?" Briggs swallowed, his silence a testament to his growing understanding of the gravity of his actions. Baker sighed, rubbing his forehead, the weight of the situation visibly wearing him down. "The DA is reviewing every single one of your cases from the past 5 years," Baker said, his voice weary but firm. "You've been flagged for racial profiling, and you better believe this department isn't going down with you." Briggs felt a cold dread grip his stomach. "What does that mean?" Baker straightened, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It means you're being put on immediate suspension, effective now. Internal Affairs is investigating, and if they find what I think they're going to find," he shook his head, his voice heavy with unspoken implications, "your career is over." The words hit Briggs like a physical blow, the realization of his downfall washing over him. His world, once ruled by his own perceived power, was unraveling in real time. For the first time in his career, he realized he wasn't untouchable. The illusion of power had shattered. The cold reality of consequences was setting in. The weight of his actions, of his prejudices, of his abuse of power was finally crushing him. His career, his reputation, his sense of self, all were crumbling before him. It was a slow, agonizing collapse, a quiet, unyielding justice. The cafe was quiet, the gentle hum of conversation, a muted backdrop to the storm brewing inside her. Renee stirred her coffee, the dark liquid swirling in the cup, mirroring the turmoil of emotions within her. Her phone buzzed. A message from her attorney. Briggs has been suspended. Might face charges. She took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through her, a small comfort against the lingering chill of the previous night. Good, she murmured, the word barely audible, yet carrying the weight of a lifetime of pent-up frustration. She glanced out the window, watching the city move on around her, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. The fight wasn't over, not for her, not for the countless others who'd likely suffered similar injustices at the hands of men like Briggs. But today was a win. A small victory in a much larger battle. Another buzz. This time, it was a familiar number. She sighed, a mixture of relief and weariness escaping her lips. She answered, "Captain," a familiar voice greeted her. "Lieutenant Commander, I assume you've seen the news?" "I have," she replied, her voice steady, controlled. "And how are you feeling?" Renee glanced at her reflection in the nearby storefront window. She saw no signs of defeat, no cracks in her composure. "I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do," she answered, her voice quiet but firm, a quiet confidence that held its own against the weight of her experience. The captain's voice softened. "That's what I thought you'd say." A pause. "The Department of Defense has taken an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it." Renee exhaled slowly through her nose. "Not sure I'm interested in being a headline." "You already are," the captain countered gently. "And whether you like it or not, what happened to you is a reflection of something bigger." Renee knew that. She'd always known it. Briggs wasn't an isolated incident. He was a symptom, a manifestation of a deeply entrenched system that allowed officers like him to operate unchecked, to abuse their power with impunity. This wasn't just about her. It was about the dozens, maybe even hundreds of people who'd been in her shoes, but who lacked the rank, the legal team, the voice to fight back. She leaned against a streetlight, watching the city flow around her. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," she said quietly, her voice filled with a weary acceptance. "And it won't be the last." "No," the captain agreed, his voice soft with understanding. "But it's the first time Briggs is facing consequences, and it's because you didn't back down." Renee closed her eyes for a second, letting those words settle. She hadn't backed down. Not when Briggs pulled her over. Not when he tried to intimidate her. Not when the handcuffs tightened around her wrists. Not even when she spent the night behind bars, knowing full well the deck was stacked against her. She'd stayed firm, and now she'd won. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who'd been silenced, overlooked, and dismissed. It was a reminder that even against overwhelming odds, even when confronted with immense power, even when the system seems stacked against you, quiet resilience can prevail. Justice, however delayed, can be served. The captain cleared his throat. "One last thing," he added softly. "You might be getting a call from the mayor's office." Renee's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh, seems they want to recognize me for handling the situation with professionalism and grace." A wry smile touched her lips. "Now that's ironic." The captain chuckled softly. "You going to accept?" Renee thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I'll think about it." The broader implications of the case, its power to inspire change, were far more significant than any personal accolades. The fight was far from over, but this was a start. The victory was not just hers. It belonged to everyone who had suffered in silence. It was a seed of hope that could one day become a tree of justice and equality. The crisp afternoon air carried the scent of fresh rain, a cleansing balm against the lingering weight of the past 24 hours. It should have been heavy on her shoulders, the exhaustion, the anger, the lingering adrenaline. Yet it wasn't. She walked with the same quiet confidence she'd always possessed, her head high, her steps steady, her purpose clear. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she recognized, her captain. She sighed, a soft sound that held a mixture of relief and a quiet underlying weariness. She answered. "Lieutenant Commander," the familiar voice greeted her, a warmth in the tone that spoke of shared experience and mutual respect. "I assume you've seen the news." "I have," Renee replied, her voice calm, unwavering. "And how are you feeling?" Renee glanced at her reflection in a nearby shop window. She saw no signs of defeat, no cracks in her composure. "I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do," she answered, her voice carrying the quiet strength of conviction. The captain's voice softened. That's what I thought you'd say. A brief pause. The Department of Defense has taken an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it. Renee exhaled slowly. Not sure I'm interested in being a headline. You already are, the captain countered gently. And whether you like it or not, what happened to you is a reflection of something bigger. Renee knew that. She'd always known it. Briggs wasn't an isolated incident. He was part of a system that allowed officers like him to operate unchecked for years, a system that had allowed for countless similar injustices to go unaddressed. This wasn't just about her. It was about the dozens, maybe hundreds of people who'd been in her shoes, who lacked the rank, the resources, the voice to fight back. She leaned against a lamppost, watching the city move around her, a tapestry of lives lived, stories untold. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. She knew that, deep in her bones. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet weight of knowledge. And it won't be the last. No, the captain agreed, a note of understanding in his voice. But it's the first time Briggs is facing consequences, and it's because you didn't back down. Renee closed her eyes, letting those words settle. She hadn't backed down. Not when Briggs pulled her over. Not when he tried to intimidate her. Not when the handcuffs bit into her wrists. Not even when she spent the night in that cold, stark cell, knowing full well the deck was stacked against her. She had stayed firm, and now she'd won. The captain cleared his throat. One last thing. You might be getting a call from the mayor's office. Renee's eyebrows lifted. Oh, seems they want to recognize me for handling the situation with professionalism and grace. She smirked, a hint of dry humor in her voice. Now that's ironic. The captain chuckled. You gonna accept? Renee considered it for a moment, then shrugged. I'll think about it. The significance of what had happened extended far beyond any personal recognition. Briggs's downfall was a small step, a single crack in a vast, hardened system. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But it was a start, a testament to the power of speaking up, of demanding change, of refusing to stay silent. Real change, she knew, began with real conversations, with the quiet resolve to fight for justice, with not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved to be treated with fairness and respect. The journey towards justice was a long one, but the journey had begun. This wasn't just about one stop. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system built on silence, a system that allowed injustice to fester. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, underestimated, remember this story. It's your story too. Share it. Let's start a conversation. Let's build a better tomorrow, one voice at a time.